So we're going to talk about the American Revolution, or known as the War for Independence, and this will be the North American colonies, or what would become the United States, against the most powerful nation in the world, Great Britain. So, the British colonies in North America, you guys know these already, but this is the New England colonies, the ones in the green there up north, the middle colonies in the purple there, and the southern colonies. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the French and Indian War, and this was fought between England and the French over control of the land in North America. The English wanted to push west, but the French blocked them. The war started over land disputes between the two nations. Really, Fort Duquesne there, if you look right here, what happened here was the French built this fort, and Virginia claimed that land. It's today Pittsburgh. Virginia claimed land pretty much all the way over to the Mississippi and about up to the Great Lakes there, Lake Erie. So when they sent George Washington, young 22-year-old surveyor and militiaman, up to see what was going on at Fort Duquesne, he built a fort called Fort Necessity, took 6 French soldiers hostage, and imprisoned them, and of course the French were not going to take that. They went and broke those guys out of Fort Necessity, and in George Washington's first battle as a leader, he lost it. So this, in essence, starts the French and Indian War. There's some pictures here. So the major thing you need to know is England's going to win this war. It's a very, very expensive war. England doesn't really change its strategy. For the first 5 years of the war, the French and the Indians who were fighting against the English dominated the war. They won most battles. England didn't want to get into this war at first. They actually spent 2 years saying that this was an illegal war that the colonists had started because England was strapped for money. They didn't have money. And they eventually joined the war. They call it the 7 Years' War because they were only involved for 7 years of this war. But this war lasted for 9 years. So, as you see, long story short, England wins the war. France loses all of their North American colonies. Very expensive war for England. They're broke. They need money. So the British Parliament says, well, since the North American colonies really kind of started this war, they should help pay for this war in taxes. Now, Britain's need to have the colonists pay for some of the war would lead to an end to what's called salutary neglect. Salutary neglect is not enforcing laws on the book. How did Britain end salutary neglect? Britain had passed laws for about 70 years on the colonists, and the colonists would choose not to follow them, and the British would not enforce those laws. So when Britain now is trying to enforce laws being passed, the colonists are saying, well, why are you doing this now? You know, you haven't done it before. So here's some laws passed. So as you see here, the Sugar Act in 1764 places a tax on sugar, coffee, indigo, and molasses. Basically, what you need to know about this is this is not a tax for all colonists that all colonists have to pay. So it doesn't affect the colonists as a whole. It affects merchants. As you see, sugar cane is used to make sugar. Sugar is used to make molasses. Molasses, of course, is used to make rum. Rum was one of the most popular and common drinks in the colonies. So this is more of a tax on merchants. Also with the sugar tax, or the Sugar Act, let's see, go back. With the Sugar Act, what's going to happen is merchants who are caught smuggling or basically alleged to be smuggling, they would be tried not in colonial courts, but they'd be tried in vice admiralty courts. And these were British courts that were a lot more stern. Also, British judges were encouraged to convict smugglers by giving the judge 5% of the profits off of the ship, if convicted. Stamp Act, 1765. England places a tax on every legal document, sales contracts, wills, newspapers, playing cards, and even dice. Americans get very angry with this tax. They said the tax was unfair, and they come up with this slogan that it's not brand new, but they come up with it, and it's no taxation without representation, because they don't have a representative in Parliament. So they said, how can you tax us if we don't have a representative in Parliament? Americans begin to organize and protest. One of the organizations that's going to come out of this is the Sons of Liberty, and they are going to pass a non-importation policy and boycott all British-made goods. So, the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770, started as a protest against the British government by the colonists. Colonists throw snowballs at the soldiers laced with rocks. They taunted the soldiers by calling them names. This was not an unarmed crowd. They had sticks, they had pitchforks, they had rocks, and they were throwing it at these soldiers. So the soldiers actually stood their ground for most of the afternoon. This was a drunken crowd, and the soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. Someone from the crowd yelled fire, and somebody fired. Interestingly enough, these soldiers were brought up for murder in a colonial court, and every single one of them got off and walked out a free man. Their attorney was none other than John Adams. The Tea Act of 1773, the British Parliament passes a law which lowers the price of tea, but still left the tax on tea. What happens here is the East India Company had about gone bankrupt, and it's a British company, from all of these colonial protests, and they're not buying products. So the British government allowed them to sell their tea tax-free, and the American colonist, or the colonist over here in North America, if it was colonial-made tea, they still had to pay taxes on the tea. So this made the British tea cheaper, and of course the colonists were extremely upset about this. So the colonists saw this as hurting American merchants, and so the Sons of Liberty, notably absent at this was Samuel Adams. He did not make this. Expedition. He had a prior engagement. Samuel Adams was not here, but the Boston Tea Party is led by the Sons of Liberty, and they disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, boarded the ships in the Boston harbor, and they dumped crates of tea into the harbor in protest against the tea tax, or the Tea Act. And they dumped 15,000 pounds of tea into the harbor, roughly about $1 million of value of tea in the harbor today. Is about $1 million in today's money. Said to have turned the harbor brown. And by the way, in response to this, the British passed the Coercive Acts in reaction to the Tea Party. Coerce means to force. So the British were going to force the colonists to obey and do what the British wanted them to do. Kind of like your parents forcing you or coercing you to do something, telling you you will do this. So the colonists call this the Intolerable Acts. What the British did was they closed the Boston harbor, and they said, hey, the harbor's closed. We're going to set up a blockade around it until you pay for the tea, which is roughly $1 million. And the Bostonians, the colonists in Massachusetts, would not do that. They suspended basic civil rights, martial law. They put a general in charge of the Boston area in Massachusetts, and they were under military rule. And housing troops in people's homes. This would be the Quartering Act, and this would be, whether you liked it or not, British soldiers were going to stay with you, and you had to pay for their food, their ammunition, and their clothes, and you had to keep them clean. American colonists take action, as you see. Colonists very angry over these new laws. The colonists felt that Parliament and the King did not have the right to tax the colonists without colonial representation. So how it worked, all taxes and laws are made by the King of England and Parliament. Only people living in England may elect these members to Parliament. If Americans cannot elect members to Parliament, then they have no representation. So these Americans say the taxes are unfair, they refuse to pay them, and they say that they have the same rights as Englishmen. They wanted representation. First Continental Congress comes about after the, it's in response to the Coercive Acts, so the Intolerable Acts. The representatives from the colonies meet in Philadelphia to discuss their rights. They send a petition to the king to restore peace. They asked the king to repeal these acts. They said they had the right to make colonial laws, threatened to halt exports to Britain, and they organized a boycott of British goods. Parliament responded by adding new taxes to the colonists, and the colonies formed militias and prepared for war. One thing we didn't talk about in these acts that Britain passed was the 1766 Declaratory Act, which basically took away the colonists' right to make laws and to make ordinances. Parliament now made all the laws as of 1766. So, and that's not in your notes in this, but you'll get it in American history. So, Second Continental Congress. Basically, nothing happened out of the First Continental Congress. All of these representatives agreed to meet again if nothing happened, and they did. In 1775, the colonists agreed to meet. The following year, if King George didn't listen to them, they ended up sending him an olive branch petition, which is like a peace treaty kind of thing, a peace offering. And they wanted to return to the way things were and for the king to forgive them. The king said, hey, you know what? They are in a state of rebellion, and he wanted the congressional leaders caught and hanged for treason. So after this Congress, the Continental Congress will, about 8 months later, agree to go to war. Really about 9 months later to a year later, they agree to go to war. So Benjamin Franklin has a famous quote, and he says, out of reading this response from the king, he says, well, either we're all going to hang together or we're going to all hang separately. So in other words, let's band together and fight Britain. The American Patriot, the Army, in the beginning, as you see, is made up of farmers, frontiersmen, townspeople who left their homes to fight the British. Many believed the war would be short. At first, they had to provide their own weapons, ammunition, and uniforms. Over time, they would be formed into a regular unit with uniforms and proper equipment. Famous picture, a famous flag. Some more pictures. So, Declaration of Independence. Written by Thomas Jefferson. He wrote the first draft. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and there were two other guys in charge of writing this thing. Roger Sherman, I believe, and maybe Robert, I can't remember the other guy. But basically, they declared independence and created the United States. The purpose was to break ties with Britain and create the United States. It's also to protect the rights and liberties of the people. Power comes from the people. The ideas do not apply to women, slaves, and Indians. Guys, this is a declaration of war, and this is a rejection of the divine right of kings. We say, hey, power comes from the people, not God. Turning point in the war was the Battle of Saratoga. The British met the American army at Saratoga, and as you see, Saratoga is in New York, and the Americans would get French help out of this, not to mention Spanish help, Dutch help. So these nations will help America. So you can read over this part of your declaration. Here's some advantages and disadvantages. I'm not going to go through them. You can read them though. You need to know these for an activity. Go. You do need to know these consequences to the war. We win $43 million in debt. I do want you to understand this. We go and we fight a revolution because we're being taxed at 12.5%, but the British citizens on the island are being taxed at 20%. Religion, the Anglican religion will not survive because the king's at the head of that religion. France is heavily in debt. Britain lost their 13 colonies. Most loyalists moved to Canada. Voting rights are expanded for most white men.